When I lived in California in 2008 during a very contentious political battle over the definition of marriage in California. And I can recall very vividly having posted a social media statement about my support for marriage and family, and I got a response back from a gentleman that described his family. This is what he described. He described he and his partner had adopted a little boy and a little girl. The little boy had some very serious health challenges from deformities, and the little girl was going to be adopted by another family that didn't want to take on the challenge of having this little boy. And the social worker that knew those two children decided to invite these men to adopt those children. And I was touched. I was touched by their willingness to raise these children. It didn't change the fact that I felt that what those children really needed was a married mother and father. But I could respect and I could show appreciation for the sentiment of wanting to be a parent and of offering those children
who others would not take, right? Others would not adopt them.
What they could at that time. So I responded back and said, essentially just that. I can appreciate what you are trying to give to these children. I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. I believe every child needs, as much as possible, needs a mother and a father. I wondered how he might respond. That might be quite offensive, right? To hear that you're not. In essence, the message that could come across is you're not enough by just being a father, and so that could be taken. I was surprised by his response. He wrote back to me and he said, "Thanks for the kind words." That was the first thing he said. He could appreciate that, in contrast to other responses that he had received, that there was an attempt there to recognize his humanity, to recognize his efforts as trying to be a father, that there could be appreciation. The first thing he says is, "Thanks for the kind words." He says, it says, "In a perfect world," it says, "I agree with you. Every child should have a mother. That's the best thing for children to have a mother and father." That surprised me. It surprised me that he felt that way as well. And he said, "Sadly, that's not how it worked out for these children. Their parents were addicted to drugs and had a very difficult time, and they couldn't take care of these children, and so my partner and I have." He said, "So yeah, in a perfect world, every child should have a mother and father. Sadly, that's not the world we live in." And that stuck out to me. Sadly, that's not the world we live in. Now that is true. We live in a fallen world. We live in an imperfect world. We live in a world where there are challenges and breakups, and where there are difficult cases like this with drug addiction and with serious deformities. But what we can give to the world, what we can give as moral advocates, what we can do as believers in marriage and family, is we can give hope for a better world. We can give hope for a better world. We can recognize what's around us. We can recognize the good where we see it, but we can also say, "Come and see that there's not a better way. There's not a better way that as a society, as a public, that we can endorse and support that every child should have a mother and a father, and that we do that best by preserving the definition of marriage, because that sends a message to the culture. Because we can't think about just every circumstance. We have to think about and look and plan for the society around us. And when we change the definition of marriage to be not from a man and a woman, but just to be unique to people, well, what we have said is that it does not matter from a family dynamics point, it does not matter to have a mother and a father. And that simply is not true. We know that's not true, and we can share our beliefs that way. We can do it as simply with an earnest, "I believe that every child is a father."
Now, how many of you, it's so natural to wonder, well, why would it matter so much just to, the way it's told is just to allow another group of people who haven't been allowed to marry. Have you ever been confronted by that question? What's the big deal? What does it mean? It's not going to change the fact that I came from two parents, and so why do we worry so much about that? And that's kind of a second piece to this, isn't it? That how do we create a world where there's fairness for all in appreciating your beliefs and mine, and that we can live together in the same world, right? Very challenging, and hopefully we'll get to some of that. I want to pull us back to this. How does redefining marriage really change marriage? And I think that term, redefining marriage, is important because what it means is marriage itself, as we have known it, where a child, and marriage really came about to put fathers connected to children. Because when a baby's born, we know who the mom is, right? She's right there. But we don't know who the dad is necessarily. And so marriage is the institution that brings a father into connection with his child. And when you get married, we think of marriage as, oh, I'm going to create this great celebration. It's my wedding and it's my thing. Marriage belongs, religiously, it belongs to God and it belongs to society in that it provides the only protection for a child to be sure that their mother and father are connected to them. Because when men and women have sexual relations, children come, right? And so marriage is the institution that means when we choose to be married, we're choosing to take care of the children who come from our relationship and to be bound together in the protection of those children. So when we break that apart, when we say, but any two people can marry, then that norm of a child having claim on the people who brought them into life, wherever possible, right? There's adoption that happens, of course, when a situation isn't healthy. But wherever possible, then marriage secures that for that child. But if any two people can marry, what does that mean for a child who's born? It means what will happen, right, is parent A, parent B, or just a parent, and that child does not have legal claim on the people who brought them into being. And it means, of course, in education, that what are we taught about marriage? It doesn't mean a child should have a mother and a father. It doesn't mean that. It doesn't mean that we need men and women. It doesn't mean that marriage is a way of bridging the gap between men and women and pulling the genders together in a way that unifies them. So marriage is changed for everybody by redefining it.
Well, no, I think pick up with the comment
about religious
here.
freedom.
Well, I think it's important to address that concern of going from the point of view of what marriage means to us, and how do we express that in a way when it feels like we are being challenged or being silenced for our beliefs. And I think it's important, first of all, to recognize that try to understand something from another's point of view. Try to see things from the other side. While it can seem like an attack to us coming against us, we also have to put ourselves in someone else's shoes to think, well, why would someone feel the way that they do about theirs? And I think what we'll find is that we, as religious believers, or as believers in morality and in the public square, or as believers in marriage as being unique between a man and a woman, that we can express ourselves and explain that this is core to our identity, who we are, and that what we are seeking is to have fairness for all, that we would be treated with the same respect that we would expect from others.
Which is interesting, that language, right? Core to identity. Your religious beliefs are core to your identity. Do you think those who experience same-sex attraction, who identify as gay, see that as core to their identity? And that's what they have wanted, right? To have their identity okay, right? For it to be okay, for them not to be fired for identifying that, whatever. And so whatever the challenges that have come, many, but in a sense, we're saying this is also core to my identity. This belief is, can there be space for both of us to be recognized in our core identities?
And an opportunity really to tell our stories. and to explain how it is that we feel about things. Oh, why don't we take an example that we've seen much about in the news in the United States. There's been a number of wedding professionals that have asked have declined to participate in a same-sex marriage. So this has happened in the cases of photographers, happened in the cases of caterers, for those that might be making
You're aware of
cake,
some of these things,
making
right? A photographer,
flower
cake baker,
arrangements.
flower arranger.
So some
The
of
pizza,
common-
Memories Pizza in Indiana, right? They were asked to cater a wedding and bring their pizza, and they said, we don't cater same-sex marriages. Or, I'm sorry, you're exactly right. Would they? That's
How
right.
many people go to a pizza
And
how
ask
many
that.
go to a pizzeria to cater their wedding, right? So a little bit of a staged example there. So thank you for that clarification. So I think those examples are instructive in how we can personally respond and the ways in which we can engage with others. Now, the way some of those stories first were presented in the news was a photographer refuses service to LGBT person, or the wedding cake refuses to do a cake for someone that's gay. Now, in that kind of a phrasing of what has happened, that seems pretty hard, right? It seems like, wait a second.
Doesn't it sound harsh to deny somebody who comes in who's gay
had
and say, I'm not going to serve you because you're gay?
Right. But then
It
when we
should sound
see-
harsh to us, because in a sense it is, right?
It's being framed that way. It's being set up that way to make to try to frame a person as being against someone, as opposed to being against an idea or against a belief. It's being framed as a way to be against a person. Our natural sense of love for other people resists being against people, and so when phrased that way, it's intended to draw on the public in order to trigger a reaction that would be against the wedding professionals. But what happens when that story is unfolded and more details and a greater knowledge about what happened comes into view? I'll take the example of Baronel Stutzman. Baronel Stutzman is the florist in Washington State who declined to be part of a marriage that she felt was objectionable to her religious beliefs. Now, Baronel is a great-grandmother. She's been a florist for 40 years. You start to realize some of these facts, and when you start to imagine a great-grandmother, it paints a little bit different picture. Then you come into the view and you see that Baronel had served for many years the gentleman that had come in, she knew of his sexual orientation, knew about his partner, had no problem in when he asked to have flower arrangements, Valentine's Day, that kind of thing. She felt like it wasn't a place for her to express her feelings to him. She could provide that transaction. She talks about being happy with his creativity. She thought he was a creative guy. She liked being able to make these flowers with him, appreciated who he was as a person, even had a love for this person that she had done business with for a number of years. At the point, though, at which he asked her to make the arrangements for his wedding, Baronel felt that goes against my conscience. Because at this point, she feels, from her perspective, she feels that she's being invited to participate, to be a part of the wedding. And from her religious feelings, her religious teachings, she believes that that would go against her conscience, that she shouldn't be for a marriage that she believes is not, in fact, a marriage. She believes marriage is between a man and a woman. For her to be involved, to put her creative effort, for her to be, in her mind, endorsing that ceremony, then she feels like that means I'm endorsing that marriage is not between a man and a woman. She doesn't feel like she can do that. Her conscience, it's not an easy decision for her. She says, I prayed about it, and she just didn't feel right about it. Takes the gentleman in his hands, tells him, I'm sorry, I can't do that. And she expresses her faith and why she can't do that. Now, when that story is told, the public hears that story, and they can understand why someone would feel that their conscience would not allow them to participate. And so when you see, once that story is told in the public sphere, then the public polling on whether or not a woman, a great-grandmother, been a florist for 40 years, whether or not she ought to be able to say, I decline to participate in a same-sex wedding, well then polling numbers, the majority of people speaking here in the United States, they support that. You phrase it differently, though, and say, should somebody not serve gay individuals? Well, no. People are going to resist that because someone shouldn't be treated differently because of who they are. But when it becomes that another person has a right to be who they are, Baronel Stutzman has a right to be who she is. She feels like her religious views prevent her from participating in a same-sex wedding. And so she can say, no, this is who I am. This is who I am. And these are why my beliefs are this way. And you might disagree with those, but I deserve to be respected and deserve to have the opportunity not to be interfered with, not to be compelled, not to lose my business, not to be sued by the government, not to be sued by individuals to do something that would be against my conscience.
Does that distinction make sense? And can you see then why this effort, why you are the leaders who will need to help frame in state legislatures legislation that allows fairness for all, for the protection of the identity of all people? In Salt Lake City, we had a situation where a police officer was asked to help assist at the Pride Parade, Utah's Salt Lake City Pride Parade. And he was part of the motorcycle crew that often do kind of show off kinds of things at the beginning of the parade. You know what I'm talking about? He asked for an accommodation that he not be required to be in that place, but that he would be happy to provide security. Because he was afraid of celebrating something that he was concerned about by his conscience. He was not granted an accommodation. Most people now looking back, I think politically, would say he should have been granted an accommodation. Even the EEOC, the Employment Equal Opportunities Commission, would say people should be given...
We would hope they would say that. The EEOC provides for religious accommodations to be given. We would hope that they would see in this particular circumstance that it's the kind of religious accommodation that should be
granted for someone who might ask, it's uncomfortable for me to work on Sunday. I need to be at worship services. Could I ask for an accommodation from my employer for that? The EEOC would say, yes, you should be able to ask for an accommodation there. And so it's that kind of legislation that we need to protect the identity of all people, to feel like they are being treated fairly as a whole person.
And recognize our rights to be able to express ourselves and to be able to live our lives, not just on Sundays, or not just yet to church, or not just in our homes, but to be able to do that in public, our places of business, in our schools. I would imagine for a number of you that it's not easy or comfortable to be in a school setting with some predominant views that might be against your own views, and it can feel quite intimidating to speak up for you. Who's had that experience? Who's felt intimidated in the classroom and not been able to express their feelings? I think it's important to recognize among people of faith there might be different responses. And so by suggesting that someone ought not to be persecuted by a government organization and being sued, having the power of the state to force someone to do something that they believe that is against conscience, is not to say that all people of faith would arrive at the same decision. And so it's important for people of faith to give a reasonable grounds for differences of opinion and exactly how that looks. Even people who agree that marriage between a man and a woman, they may have different responses to how they personally feel in their participation, being invited themselves personally, being asked to provide in their role as a business person, maybe person of clergy, there are going to be different responses. People are going to have different feelings about that, and those religious responses should be welcomed and should be given freedom. When I think that a concern would be when the role of the government is used to coerce certain responses. Now, in the United States, in the 60s and 70s, there was, primarily in the 60s, there was a great debate over whether or not the power of the government ought to be used in order to prevent racial discrimination. And the debate that raged was, well, you can't legislate morality. And so people were concerned with using the power of the state to compel individuals to not discriminate. Now, as a society, because of probably for a lot of reasons, very particular to race, with a great history, Civil War in this nation, with a century of Jim Crow laws in the South, a decision was made to use the coercive power of the state to allow for penalties for someone that discriminated on the basis of race. That also then was extended with respect to gender. Sometimes those are treated differently. Now, there was a reasonable debate at that time in the 60s over what was the appropriate power and role of the government and how to enforce that. In our current era, that's not really debated, and it's taken as accepted that there's a role for government in preventing discrimination on the basis of race. What is very different is, and that's why it's so important to distinguish between racial discrimination and between religious beliefs about marriage and family. And addressing the question from the student from the Harvard Divinity School, I think it's been helpful for me to think about our role, our religious sphere, and where our religious rights have, our religious freedoms are strongest, and then in some places where they are less strong. Our religious freedom is strongest, first of all, in our pulpits. Right? Our churches should be free, completely free. Now, there are multitudinous different views from churches across the United States, Mexico, and across the world over how to respond to the issues of sexual orientation, of gender identity. And those churches should be free, entirely free to take their positions, to advocate for morality, to do so not only over the pulpit, but to do so in the public, to advance their beliefs on morality, their beliefs on religion, to advocate for that. I think for the most part we recognize that, and we do a good job. Sometimes you'll hear, and there are tensions, certainly voices, cultural voices that would want to silence churches, keep churches out of the public space. Those that support religious freedom need to stand up for the churches, need to stand up for religious voices in the public, being able to engage in the public. Second area where our religious freedoms are very strong is in our homes. We heard yesterday in the beginning speech of this World Congress from Elder M. Russell Ballard of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints give a strong defense of the right of parents to teach their children. That doesn't extend only in the home, but also extends to their children when they are away from the home and in school. So our families have a very strong sphere at which our religious freedoms ought to be protected. Now, when we start to move away from the church and the home, and we engage in the public, there become some difficulties and challenges. We have to, in a pluralistic society, we have to respect religious differences. We have to respect differences from those that are not religious. And so when we engage in the public, there becomes some tension, and sorting out where is the right balance there can be difficult. But the one area where even when we enter into the public sphere, where we don't lose our religious freedom is in our matters of conscience. And those conscience, the matters the individually ought to be respected. when someone is asked to participate. Now, let's try to tease out some of these examples in this last sphere. And I'm going to draw upon the example of the state of Utah and its decision on how to balance LGBT protections and religious freedoms. So this past March, the Utah legislature, big majorities. This was historic to see these kinds of majorities endorsing this legislation. You had super majorities in both houses. You had the governor all supporting legislation. They found a way to try to balance this. Now, on the one hand, in housing, let's maybe take an example of housing. If a couple were to try to, say, two men or two women were to try to rent an apartment in a very large complex, okay, hundreds of units, the law says they ought to be able to do that without any interference from someone, say an owner of that apartment complex. That owner doesn't have a right to say, well, because your conduct violates my religious principles, you can't stay in this large apartment complex. The reason for that is because his sphere, right, or her sphere, doesn't extend out to it has limits in how far it extends to be able to enforce that particular religious their religious beliefs about that. But then on the other end, let's say you have a family that's renting out their basement, or they might have a duplex. At that point, it's the family setting. And so someone ought to be able to politely decline if it is against their conscience, or if they're uncomfortable. They can say, we simply, we don't, we want to maintain control over our space and rent to, and rent our space according to just how we feel about it.
And you can see how it's much closer, right, to their home and their ability to live out their beliefs in their home or according to their conscience, because it's so much closer than a big complex. The same thing would happen with employment. If you were a small business owner, should someone who is living a gay lifestyle come to you, you would have the protection to say, this is a really small business. I've got my nephews and nieces working for me, and my wife, and small business. I get to discriminate or discern on who's working closely with me. What about a big, sorry.
And really, I think it's not really discrimination in that kind of a level, at a family level. It's simply a decision to say, this is my my business. It's a small business. When we exercise our religious rights, we don't have to feel like we're discriminating. I mean, it's important to recognize the point about discernment, but I don't think we don't need to use the language of discrimination, because it's not discrimination to have religious beliefs and to exercise those in the proper sphere.
So you can see how in employment and housing there was this balance created to best protect or accommodate a person to live out their religious beliefs in their own home, protect their environment, protect the things closest to them, while protecting access to employment and housing for GLBT people.
Now, the reality is, I don't think there are many apartment owners out there that were going to decline their apartment spaces to same-sex couples. Most apartment owners are just happy to have people renting their buildings, and coming into their space. So that doesn't happen. People don't make those kinds of distinctions based on whether someone's married or not. There are probably many cohabiting couples that might be in apartments, and apartment owners don't typically make a judgment over whether or not they're going to allow cohabitation. So, but you could see from the other perspective, the suggestion was, well, in some religious communities, for instance in Utah, you might have many apartment owners that would be of a particular religion, and maybe we'd be discriminated. We wouldn't be able to live anywhere. And so we say, as trying to accommodate and being fair to all, we would say someone ought to be able to live and to have an apartment and to have a job in a big company and to work and to be in our society without the fear that because of who they are and their sexual orientation, that they would be unable to find a place to live, unable to have employment, to be able to provide for themselves. But when there are spheres, when it is the proper sphere of our religious freedom, then individuals exercising a diversity of views, a diversity of religious beliefs about what is proper, because people are going to disagree, and there's going to be a space on what they think is the proper response. They ought to be able to have the freedom to do so within the confines of their homes, within their churches, within small businesses that are like, in many respects, a family businesses. And the individual, their conscience. My wife mentioned the Salt Lake City police officers. The Salt Lake City police officer was assigned to a motorcycle unit that did stunts in front of the parade. He asked to be reassigned to provide security to that parade, not to be the one doing the stunts themselves. People of good faith might have different responses. Other people might not have
had any problem with that, right?
But he did, and we should protect and we should value someone's objection and conscience. They don't feel like that they can do that in good faith. What is it for us to compel? What is it for the force of government to compel someone to do something that they believe is against their religious faith? And so there's a place to make an accommodation. It doesn't have to be a show about it. He didn't. He simply asked his supervisor, said, "No, could I be reassigned? Could I be accommodated and provide security in this situation?" But because it's such a sensitive and such a toxic issue, there was immediately an association that this individual was bigoted and discriminatory, and he was treated as such. And so finding ways to share beliefs and to defend those that have for their conscience beliefs is important to tell their stories.
Does that help? The point here is these are difficult questions, and there's a couple of principles to guide it, right? That there's zones that deserve, and I think at the heart of this, we have to take seriously people's religious beliefs. We have to. Conscience, without that protection, other liberties mean little. Freedom of the press, freedom to gather, if we can't live according to conscience, that all those other freedoms are diminished. Now, the answer to how these are reconciled, it's not always clear, right? But to take seriously those two principles. Right. Yeah, no, thank you for engaging on this really important. These are the kind of discussions, right?
It's triggered a lot of hands, and I think we ought to give a little space for conversation, but I would like to just briefly, I think there's a distinction that can be made with respect to service that involves personal participation. And I think that's the point. And that's hard to tease out that line, but I think that, for instance, the Salt Lake City police officer, to use that example again, the distinction that he made was, as a police officer, I'm bound to serve and protect. That's what I signed up for. And having met him personally, when he told me I'd take a bullet for in protecting the Pride Parade, I believe him. And I believe he was sincere in that. He saw his role as serving, and he had no problem. There was no denial of service. And I would say, I would have no problem saying that if a police officer declined to provide service to any member of the community, including the LGBT community, that police officer should be removed from their position. That wasn't the case here. That's how it was presented in the media. Presented in the media as if that was the case. What it actually was he was assigned to a participatory role in a parade. And for him, that crossed a line of conscience. It might not cross another person's line of conscience, but for him it did. And I guess what our feelings would be is that there's a place for respect for that. And how that translates and where that line of conscience and participating is in providing, for instance, if you're selling flowers, somebody else is going to arrange, maybe you don't feel like that's participating. And there's no problem doing that. But when someone's investing their creative energy, they feel like at that point, and I think that was what was the case for the Washington florist. She didn't have any problem providing flowers and serving this gentleman for a number of years. But when it crossed the line where she felt like she was participating in, reasonable people might disagree about whether or not that's participating in the same-sex marriage, but there was an issue of conscience that arose from her. And so trying to separate those out is not easy. It's a difficult line, but finding that personal conscience space of when am I being asked to do something that goes against my conscience, and how do we preserve that? And of course, then with why don't we